Hello, everybody, and welcome to EarthX CEO, a weekly series on EarthX TV. And each week we speak to business presidents and CEOs about their leadership on sustainability and climate issues. I'm your host, Bob Perciasepe, president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And with me today is Thad Hill, CEO of Calpine, one of the largest power producers in the United States and one with some of the lowest emissions. Over 26 gigawatts of power, 20 plus states, Canada and Mexico are part of their customer base. So welcome, Thad.
Thanks, Bob. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're really happy to have you. And I think the best thing to do to get started on the expanse of all the different states and types of generation you have to ask you to say a little bit about the company and where you see the company sitting in the business world here.
Thanks, Bob. So, our company, Calpine, I'd really say there are four fundamental things that we do. First off, and core to our history is our late model efficient gas generation fleet. We have almost 26,000 megawatts, almost all combined cycles. These are late model, efficient, and flexible units, and flexibility matters a lot in today's world. And first and foremost, we take pride in being really good operators. The second part of our business would be our geothermal fleet. We have together 13 different power plants that comprise our Geysers geothermal asset, which is the largest geothermal power facility in the world. And it's actually the largest single renewable asset in the state of California. It makes 6 million megawatt hours of reliable energy every year, and it's really cool as well. Thirdly, we have a trading business. As you can imagine, we procure a lot of gas, we sell a lot of power, we have a lot of information because we do that, and we have a trading and marketing wholesale business. And finally, we've got a retail arm. We have residential customers in kind of mid-Atlantic through the Northeast, as well as a bunch here in Texas. We also have what I believe to be about one of the most sophisticated commercial and industrial, where we sell direct to large companies as well. The thing about our business, we reflect on, is a regional scale for us really matters. So we really try and be one of the top generators in each of the markets we serve: the West, Texas, New England, and then again the Mid-Atlantic through the Midwest. And we're very focused on our advocacy. We believe in two fundamental things: the competitive markets work better than governments determining outcomes. And secondly, for environmental advocacy, which I'm sure we'll come back and talk about in a minute. And then finally, just to give you kind of an idea, we've got two public peers. We are now a private company, and our two public peers are NRG and Vistra, and we are about in between them and about the size of the company, just to give you a rough order of magnitude.
Well, it's pretty expansive, and thanks for that very high-level overview. As a major producer, you're obviously in the middle of how things are evolving in the power sector in the United States, and to a certain extent globally, but certainly in the United States and North America. And I think all of us are seeing big changes happening, emissions going down, even different ways of dealing with customers. So what are you seeing in the major trends in the industry from your vantage point?
Well, I'll start high level and just name a couple. And I would say, you mentioned the term trends. Part of my job as a capital allocator is to differentiate between secular and cyclical trends. And the two trends I'm going to mention are both secular, which is they're going one way and I don't think are reversible. The first of them is much more heavy renewables. Renewables, not only because of policy support, but now even more so because of the economics of the renewables themselves, are going to continue to play a larger and larger role in our energy mix. And there will be storage mixed in there as well, energy storage, which will be further changes. And we can come back and talk more about that later. But that's clearly a secular trend that is changing the way we operate and the way we think about these markets. The second trend is actually even a little more macro, which is that of decarbonization. And as we decarbonize our economy, electric use is going to grow, and that has big implications for the way we run our business. And let me just give you a little more of an example of why that's going to be the case. And I'm going to pick California here as an example, but we could do this about most markets. California is a little more of an advanced case, but in the state of California has goals of reducing its CO2 by 40% by 2030 from today, and 80% by 2050. It's actually a little tighter than that now. But let me just stick with the 40% by 2030. Today in California, only 10% of the greenhouse gases produced actually come from the in-state power generation sector. Over 40% come from transportation, 20% from agriculture, with the balance from home heating, industrial use, et cetera. But if you actually take 10 percentage points, you're trying to reduce 40% over the next 10 years, you're going to have to shift a lot of other items to electrification. And this equals load growth and really changes. So both of these are just massive trends that I think over the next 10 years are just going to continue to roll forward.
Now, I think electrification, as it's generally called, is a big trend that is moving forward. I mean, when you talk about electricity and you try to electrify a significant amount of the light duty vehicles, for instance, that's going to be a big demand. How much do you think the demand might grow? I mean, do you guys estimate some amount that you might have to grow to accommodate this?
Well, we have worked with a lot of consultants, and it's actually different by the different economies around the country. Just speaking at the United States, each regional economy has its different mix of current sources of carbon, and it's got its different mix of renewable potentials and other things. But I think it's fair to say all of the forecasts I've seen, different a little bit by part of the country, is over the next 20 years or so, somewhere between 50% to 100% of load growth versus today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an estimate I've heard to 50% up, maybe even a doubling, but depends on how quickly it goes. You mentioned geothermal and you mentioned geysers. I think most people tuning in may not know what that is or where it is. It sounds like something in Yellowstone Park, but it's a unique location. Tell us a little bit about it, and also, as you're looking around the country, that's a very unique location. Are there opportunities for geothermal in other parts of the country?
Well, excuse me if you hear the enthusiasm come out. I've worked in and around many different ways to generate electricity, and it's by far, in my view, the coolest way to generate electricity on the planet. It also is, Bob, as you mentioned, a very unique resource that is going to be hard to replicate in other parts of the country. So essentially, the geysers is a giant tea kettle in a simplest sense. You have impermeable cap rock with a bunch of porous rock underneath where if water is hot, it turns to steam, it can transfer, and then superheated bedrock at the bottom. So what happens is water that gets in turns to steam because of the heated bedrock. It can move around like steam would in a tea kettle, and you can poke a hole in the impermeable bedrock and you actually, cap rock, and you get steam out at enough pressure and enough heat to actually spin big turbines and generate electricity. Like all tea kettles, and the magic of this particular resource is that over time, you deplete the water or the steam in the kettle. We actually, at the geysers, which is one of the reasons why it's so special, take all of the twice-treated wastewater from Santa Rosa in Sonoma County, and this is in Sonoma and Lake County, California, and Lake County, California, and they ship us their gray water, and we put it back in the ground. And so you can actually think of it, we take gray water that instead of having to be treated a third time and get put back in rivers, we actually put 10,000 feet under the ground, and it comes back out as steam, and we keep refilling the tea kettle. So it's very unique geology, both the geology I just described as well as the source of the water. But it is a very reliable source. It's very important to Northern California as well, and the reliability.
Yeah, it's a pretty large source of emission-free electricity in California. So you're putting a little bit more, I asked you to put a little bit of a crystal ball on or hold on to it on how much demand may change, but how do you see this overall transition taking place over the next couple of decades? And everybody sort of points to the middle of the century where we really have to be significantly decarbonized. How do you see that continuing to unfold, in the trends that you've already identified?
Well, so, on the supply side, something that I think people are just beginning to realize, and we can talk more about this in a minute, is that natural gas is going to play a very important role. And let me back it up. I should say the natural gas fleet. What you find when you game this out and you actually do the serious work around the physics and the economics, the academic work, is that you can, as load grows and you electrify, you move a lot of extra load on the electric system. Wind and solar can cover a lot of it, and storage can help a lot too. But you actually end up with events, and these can be a dry hydro year in the West, where you can have 5,000 less megawatts available to the grid for a year. It can be a nor'easter in New England, where you end up with 2 feet of snow on top of solar panels, and 4-hour batteries aren't going to help you when that's the case. And so, we're actually, I believe, fleets like ours over time will ultimately run less, maybe not immediately, but that's not a bad thing because renewables will produce more of the power of the lower carbon. There are going to be times when that resource is absolutely required for reliability. And so I do think, a lot more renewables, a lot more load, and I actually honestly do believe that these units are going to be around for decades, or units like them, in order to balance it when these tail events occur, which do occur, and we've seen perfect instances, many instances of that. There's another thing on this, which is I actually do believe that things, I mentioned it's secular, but may move a little more slowly than a lot of people think. I mean, and take this as a personal opinion, but I, for better or for worse, I chose a career which is very subject to command and control. It is very easy, relatively speaking, for a regulator to say, shut your coal plant and build a wind farm, or whatever it might be. We don't operate coal, but as an example, to shut something down and build something else, when you're talking big macro power plants. It is a lot harder, Bob, to say to you have to sell your F-150 and buy a Leaf. And we're at the point now where a lot of the easy, low-hanging fruit on the grid has been taken. And we're at the point where people are going to have to start changing their lives and making personal economic decisions versus having those made for them. It doesn't mean we're not going to get there, but so let me not be a naysayer because we're definitely behind, and it's in our interest for electrification too. I just think it's going to be a fascinating experience as we actually start to see people have to change their lives. So I will get there. I've got no doubt about it. I just think it's going to be very interesting to see how fast that rolls out.
Yeah, well, there's certainly the demand side is a really important part of this. And we see this in many other industries, people slowly but surely starting to demand more sustainable products and more, lower emitting electricity. And so that is evolving along with the way we're dealing with the transition in energy. So you started to talk a little bit about some of your views, as a leader, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, Thad, you've been doing this job. You've been at Calpine for a while, but you've been doing this job since 2014 and pushing the company, toward these goals. What are some of the motivators for you in this? There could be business ones, there could be personal ones, there could be financial ones. For the company, what's that mix of motivators?
Well, I think there is business, there is personal. I also think there's and maybe this is personal and business, kind of a analytical. I mean, look, I want us as Calpine to be on the right side of history. And I want us to be here. As I mentioned, this transition is going to occur, and I want us to play our role and be supportive in the transition. We are backers of climate change. We're supportive of President Obama's Clean Power Plan. We have been supporters of AB 32 in the West, which is effectively the carbon price in the West Coast, and RGGI, which is the East Coast carbon pricing. And I believe the right way to get this done, and we may or may not come back and talk policy later, but isn't through a bunch of government mandates, but is through a price of carbon and let markets work. And so we're very supportive of that. And I do think, this trend is going to happen, only be on the right side of history. I also happen to believe that there's really no real debate about climate change, but we have one side really talking about the science behind climate change, and others who may deny it. But the science behind climate change, people fall back to science, but it's amazing how many of the solutions or the paths forward actually aren't ground analytically or in the science, where people rely on the science to diagnose the problem, but not to prescribe the right solution. And I happen to believe that by the rigorous focus on analytics and paying attention to the physics and the economics, we can get to a much better place. And for me, that's both hopefully we can find a way as Calpine to make money through that transition, but it's also personally satisfying if we come up with a much better solution for society to get there. So all of those are kind of rolled together. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it does. I mean, look, electricity and the availability of electricity is intimately intertwined with the quality of life going forward for people. And that we just talked about how the demand for electricity is going to grow because we're going to need more of it. And so the opportunities are obviously pretty high, as well as the challenges are very strong. But you've got to have that commitment, and I appreciate you talking about how you look at this. Now, you touched on policy. And I'll just say something very quick. When I started in the business of dealing with air pollution and water pollution back in the late 70s and early 80s, whenever Congress would pass a law, or my General Assembly in the state I was working in passed a law, it usually included a to-do list for me to tell businesses what to do. And I know that you're familiar with this. But now we have businesses like yourself and many others saying, look, we know we got to do this and we want to get there. And so instead of having to say, this is what you need to do, now it seems like there's an opportunity for policy to say, here's what we can do as a government in partnership to help you get there. And so in that context, what kind of policies can there be at the federal level or at the state level? You mentioned California several times, but at the national level that can really help put some wind in the sails to move things forward.
Well, I want to I'm going to answer your question directly, but I want to set the stage a little maybe for a minute. There are, almost half the states in this country actually have some form of climate change policy, whether it's a RPS target or a more, if you include more than half, you include RPS targets, but local Green New Deal or net carbon neutrality by a date. And I would say that it's pretty clear in many of these states that the policies, as I mentioned before, has actually outstripped the academic work. We actually have people have actually put targets out there and haven't necessarily thought about the way they're going to achieve them. I think it's really instructive. In the last year, the academic work has begun to catch up with the policy. And there was a great report that Secretary Moniz, who was President Obama's Secretary of Energy, did about how do you decarbonize California. There's been work by a consulting firm called E3 and others too that are focused on what it takes to decarbonize different parts of the country. And I talked a little bit earlier about the role of natural gas as an enabler. And I think that kind of thing comes out very clearly when you actually work your way through this report. So I'm glad that the work and the serious thinking and the analytical approach was catching up. But when it comes down to this, Bob, I really think, at one level, there's two choices. One is you actually have politicians try and pick how much of what you need. Where are you going to set CAFE standards, or what, how much solar or wind, or what should those tax credits be? Or what are you going to do about energy efficiency? And it's a very complicated set of things that intersect to make all this happen. And some people that are either elected officials or people that are in part of the bureaucracy making all of these huge calls is a much less efficient way to do it than to rely on a market. And the academic work on that is extensive. And so in our view, the number one thing that can be done is to actually put a economy-wide cost on carbon. And by economy-wide, I meant, and I hinted at this earlier, but the goal here, I'm in the electricity sector, is not to decarbonize the electricity sector. The goal is to decarbonize the entire economy, and a economy-wide cost of carbon by all means. And we're active in a couple of groups in Washington. One is called the CEO Climate Dialogue. The other is the Climate Leadership Council. One's kind of center left, one's kind of center right, with some NGOs and other large companies mixed in. And we're actively and publicly advocating to put a economy-wide cost of carbon is a far better way than having government kind of deepen all the piece parts.
Yes, but government will be involved with how to run the price.
You can't escape it. You're right. I mean, look, and government's going to have to set the targets. Yeah. I mean, government's government for a reason, and our view is. So I'm not trying to be like complete libertarian-ish here. I mean, there needs to be a goal that gets set on, and the mechanisms that are there. But I think the beautiful thing about this is that if we can set the targets and can set up the market structure, then government can take a step back. And I promise you, a lot of smart people that are competing and will compete to deploy their own capital, and we'll get where we need to get.
Well, my own group, C2ES, is involved with the CEO Climate Dialogue, and we've done an analysis of decarbonizing the economy, as you point out, and it includes many of the attributes that you're talking about. But decarbonized electricity plays a very key role as you electrify the other parts of the economy where that can happen. There's you've joined recently, I think, this summer, I think, the Carbon Capture Coalition, which we were actually one of the co-conveners of it, or the co-founders of it back almost 10 years ago now, but now we're just a participant working with the Great Plains Institute. But this is a group of 80 different institutions, from labor to industry to other NGOs, all looking at policies that could help move along this one particular type of technology, because it applies to so many different places, whether it's cement manufacturing or power generation, or even chemical plants. So what motivated you guys to join up with the Carbon Capture Coalition? Do you see this utility of this type of technology in the near term or in the long term?
I think it's probably the medium term. I think we'll hopefully have some projects in the near term, but it's going to have to be a part of the solution. As I mentioned earlier, there is no way to get to these deep economy-wide decarbonization without having existing fossil assets. Gas plants like ours play a role. The idea of having enough biogas from landfills or from agricultural uses to make that work is a long shot. Hydrogen can play some role, but it's very expensive. And that's probably a lot further out, true green hydrogen, to actually be competitive. And so I actually think, carbon capture and sequestration has a role to play. I mentioned earlier, and again, Secretary Muniz's work in California. As a part of that work, and it's in the report, it's buried, but it is there. They actually came out and suggested that California achieve its 2030 goal, not its long-term goal, but its 2030 goal. The shadow price of carbon needs to be $400 a ton. That's staggering. For people who may not be familiar, the carbon price right now on the West Coast in the AB 32 is about $17 a ton. On the East Coast in RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, it's about $6 a ton. Most economists, and Bob, you can keep me honest here, but loosely say the societal cost of carbon, if you're trying to, kind of cost society, is about $40 a ton. So, the Energy Futures Initiative, the EFI, Secretary Muniz's group, said $400 a ton by 2030. I will tell you that at $40 a ton, CCUS for gas plants does not work, but it works at a number that's far closer to $40 than to $400 a ton. And so as we move forward, I actually do believe that it will be economic in all of our best interests to actually learn to burn fossil fuels at centralized locations and pull the carbon streams out. So yes, Bob, we're part of that. We're working on our own efforts here at Calpine. And I don't think it'll be part of the near-term solution. There are a lot of things that are a lot cheaper than the price of CCUS. But as you continue to decarbonize and get further down that curve, I actually do believe it will become in the money, so to speak, and will make a lot of sense.
Yeah. The issue you have with the gas turbines is the concentration of carbon dioxide, which is one of the reasons we like using them, is a lot lower. And so it takes a lot more capturing to take place there. You mentioned hydrogen. the making hydrogen from natural gas is another technology that people have been talking about, and it also emits carbon dioxide when you do that. So carbon capture would be needed there as well. So I'm glad you guys are part of that coalition. I think having that broad group together working on this is really important, because as you get further toward the middle of the decade, toward the middle of the century, we can't afford to not have some more eggs in the basket, as I say, in terms of technology inclusiveness. So on the overall view of how this works for Calpine, how do you see this working with your broader brand? We talked about your views, we talked about sort of the companies and the technology, but now, when you're out there talking to customers, to investors, how do you see this as your brand?
Yeah, well, the way we brand ourselves in our large commercial and industrial customer sales, this is from our Calpine Energy Solutions group. We call it sensible sustainability. And that is our retail group. So it's not a overall corporate, but I actually think that has a nice ring in it, and it generally sums it up. We are all dictated by the law of physics and economics. We all know where we need to go, and as I mentioned up front, we believe in competition and we believe in environmental advocacy. And I hope between those two, and by the way, the deep power of being analytically, rigorous about the approaches we take. So I hope, that is more or less our brand. We try and call them like we see it. And we're, going to be aggressive in our advocacy, and hopefully we'll make some of the right calls along the way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, being involved with some of these groups that you've mentioned, the Climate Leadership Council and the CEO Climate Dialogue, certainly puts you front and center in places where the conversations are going on now about how to move forward on both policy and also on research and development. Do you see a role for the federal government in its sort of center of mass kind of approach on research and development, let's say at the national labs in the Department of Energy, on any of these things, whether it's batteries or even CCUS?
And this is a personal view, Bob, I'm sure it will not be as informed as your view. But I actually think the federal government with early stage research is an appropriate place to be. I think as we actually move down the curve and resources get to the point where they're actually commercially deployable, I actually think they need to stand on their own. And this is a great example for this, although no longer cutting edge, but would be wind and solar. I will tell you that I believe wind and solar are economic. Solar may be more than wind today, depending on what part of the country you're in, and that continued federal support, in this case in tax credits, not research, so I'm going a little further afield than your question, but it's probably no longer required. And these resources can definitely compete on their own, and there's no reason for the taxpayers to continue to support it. There are other technologies. Lithium-ion batteries are getting a long way down the curve too. They're getting deployed, but there may be some other items which needed. So I just think there's an early development role, but ultimately it needs to move to a market-based system.
So one more question here, and then I'll let you do whatever summary you want. But you talked about the wind resources and solar now, and you talked about, and you guys are in a number of different states. Obviously, I may have this wrong, Thad, but you as a single company might be in more states than any other power company. I think that might be true, but how important is transmission and even distribution at a more local level, and the role of the interstate issues with moving power around? I mean, there's a lot of talk about this. I mean, if you want to do offshore wind, you got to have some kind of transmission system into the shore. Wind resources in the Midwest and in the West to the coasts. How are you guys looking at that issue, given your spread?
Yeah, so, and I don't know that we're in the most states, but we'll certainly be a handful that is. I wish I knew that statistic. I actually don't. we may be. But obviously, the source of the power needs to be connected to the load. And it is our view that though a real economic test should be employed when that happens. And we haven't talked a lot today, Bob, about competition in these markets. I've kind of mentioned my market philosophy. But if you actually go to these organized markets around the country and pick a place, you'll actually have seen, and I know the statistics in Pennsylvania because I just looked at them recently, but if you go back a number of years, the regulated part of the electric bill in the state of Pennsylvania, the transmission distribution charge, used to be something like 25 to 30% of the bill, and now it's 65 to 70% of the bill in less than a decade. And part of this is because competition has actually worked so well on the generation side that prices have come down, which is a really positive thing. Part of it is a lot of the companies that operate transmission distribution have been incredibly successful at actually getting their rate bases more and more inflated, which has actually provided, their shareholders obviously returns, but not all of it has been justified in a way that these folks have, kind of managed to work. So I actually, again, they're very good companies out there, and I'm not trying to call, anybody into shame, but the fact of the matter is, a lot of times in this country, the first thing we say is, build more transmission, and people's bills go up a lot. And I actually think that a real economic test before we start building is important. And by the way, I would say a lot of commercial industrial customers have caught onto this and are now a lot more concerned about what happens to the regulated side of the bill than their unregulated side of the bill. And I think that's a very appropriate place to look. A little bit of a rabbit trail, but I want to be clear, competition works and sometimes the other side doesn't work so well.
Well, I think that's a good segue to the end here. And I want to really thank you, Thad, for taking time out of all of our schedules. They seem to be more aggressive even in the time of socially distancing work. But and if we weren't, we may be together somewhere doing this nice little chat. But I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, on EarthX TV. And I'll leave it to you to have any last particular word you may want to add to your points already.
No, Bob, I appreciate it. I wish I was in the same room as you. I look forward to when that can happen again. I've certainly enjoyed the conversation, and I just think that keeping our eye on the ultimate prize, which is decarbonizing the economy and leveraging markets, would be our two key points. But I certainly appreciate having a chance to discuss it with you.
All right. Well, that says it all. Thank you.
Thank you.